Let's pray. Father in heaven, we come before your awesome throne with open hearts, open minds. We want to hear your voice. This is a very solemn presentation. Names will be mentioned, not to question the motives that the people have that I'm going to quote, but to show that it's very possible and probable that at some point religious legislation will be brought into the Constitution. So be with us, open our minds and hearts, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In our last session, we studied Ellen White's blueprint of end-time events. The big question is, was her view of end-time events realistic and accurate? The United States has a history of respecting civil and religious liberty. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave, people say. There never could be persecution in these United States of America. However, as we noticed, at the end of the 19th century, actually from a little beyond the middle to the end of the 19th century, there was a national reform movement to establish a national Sunday law. And many people were persecuted in certain states because they did not respect Sunday as a day of worship. Also, we're going to notice in the latter half of the 20th century and the early 21st century, there was a movement in the United States driven by religious leaders and certain political leaders to also use the state to favor the agenda of the church. And so in our study today, we are going to take a look at the movement that took place in the 1980s, 1990s, and the early 2000s. Now, I need to make something clear. I'm going to mention proper names of individuals. However, I want everyone to understand that it is not my intention to impugn the motives of those individuals whom I will mention in this presentation. I will not question their sincerity in what they believed and in what they were doing. I can only bring to view what they said on the record. God will be the one that will have to judge their motivations and whether what they were doing is actually right or not. Saul of Tarsus provides us a vivid illustration of one who was absolutely sincere in persecuting what the book of Acts calls the way, that is, Christians. Saul was certain that he was doing God's will in persecuting the church. He sought out Christians to take them to trial, and some of them were condemned to death, according to Acts chapter 26. His intention was to preserve the orthodoxy of the Jewish religion, and he did it in the name of God. He was zealous, he was relentless, but his work was misguided. As I mentioned before, in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, our own, the great religious leaders of the United States were advocating causes similar to those that the national reform movement had from the middle to the end of the 19th century. The humanist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote some very wise words. I quote, "Be careful when you fight the dragon, lest you become a dragon." Is it possible that in fighting against the dragon of secular humanism, or the political left as it's called today, that the Christian right will become the dragon that they actually are attempting to overcome? Now, I'm going to mention the chief protagonists of this movement in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. Some of these individuals have passed away. Others are still living today. What were the chief protagonists? The late Chuck Colson, president of International Prison Ministries, who did wonderful work with prisoners in the United States and abroad as well. The late D. James Kennedy, pastor of the Coral Ridge Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Very good preacher. I would tune him in on Sundays and listen. He had very good material. Pat Robertson, president of the Christian Broadcasting Network, the 700 Club, CEO of Regent University, founder of the American Center for Law and Justice. Keith Fournier, who was the first executive director of Pat Robertson's American Center for Law and Justice, a Roman Catholic. The late Jerry Falwell, longtime pastor of the Thomas Road Baptist Church, chancellor of Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, and founder of the Moral Majority. James Dobson, president and CEO of Focus on the Family. And Focus on the Family has many, many wonderful, marvelous programs. Rod Parsley, who operates Harvest Ministries in Columbus, Ohio, has a large church there. Gary Bauer, president of the Family Research Council. The late Bill Bright, president of Campus Crusade for Christ, did many, many good things with students on our campuses. William Bennett, author of the Book of Virtues, an education secretary during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and drug czar during the presidency of George H.W. Bush. The late Tim LaHaye, president of the American Coalition for Traditional Values, and author of the wildly popular Left Behind series, which provides the eschatological foundation for the Christian right movement and for a futuristic approach to Bible prophecy. John Hagee, pastor of the Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, packs his church every Sunday, and prolific author on Bible prophecy from a futurist perspective. Ralph Reed, first president of Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition, and now I believe he's a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. The late John Whitehead, founder of the Rutherford Institute, a conservative think tank. Jimmy Swaggart, who at the time was a megachurch founder and television evangelist. And William Rehnquist, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States for 19 years. Now, the first thing which I find distressing during this period is tampering with the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. What was being said in the 80s and 90s and even to the early 2000s is that the First Amendment forbids simply the establishment of a national church or favoring one church above another, but it does not forbid the government from favoring all churches equally. In 1994, the Republican Party in Congress unveiled its agenda in the book Contract with the American Family. On pages 4 and 5, we find the following interpretation of the Establishment Clause. The Founding Fathers intended the Establishment Clause to ensure that America's political institutions would never be used to benefit one religion at the expense of another. It's interesting that at this time, the Speaker of the House was Newt Gingrich, who was a Baptist and converted to the Roman Catholic Church. Also, we find in this document, Contract with the American Family, the following words. Europeans believed that the European system of officially sanctioned state religions benefited neither the state nor the religion involved. Indeed, it was from such systems that the Pilgrims and Puritans fled. This is what is rightly meant by the phrase, separation of church and state. In other words, what the Contract with the American Family is saying is that the First Amendment simply forbids the establishment of a national church. And that's what is meant by separation of church and state. William Rehnquist, as I mentioned before, served 19 years as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1985, he dissented with the majority in a school prayer case, stating that the framers of the Constitution intended only, and now I quote, to prohibit the designation of any church as a national one, and to stop the federal government from asserting a preference of one religious denomination or sect over others. This was a revisionist interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Nowhere does the Establishment Clause of the Constitution refer to the non-establishment of a church or a religion, but rather of religion, period. The Founding Fathers certainly knew the history of the papacy, where the papacy, a church, used the civil powers of Europe to enforce its agenda and to persecute anyone who was not in harmony with the church. The Founding Fathers also knew the history of the colonial period, where individuals were punished with civil penalties for not going along with the desires of the established church, which was the Church of the Puritans or the Anglican Church. Rehnquist affirmed that the Establishment Clause merely, and now I quote, forbade the establishment of a national religion and forbade preference among religious sects and denominations. However, the First Amendment does not say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a church or a religion. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law establishing religion, period, not a church or a religion. According to Rehnquist, the Establishment Clause does not forbid, and now I quote, does not prohibit the federal government from providing non-discriminatory aid to religion. What does he mean by that? What it means is that the government can provide aid to churches as long as it does not discriminate among churches, as long as it helps all religions equally. Of course, the question is, would this also include Islam? Would it include Buddhism? Would it include Hinduism or any non-Christian religion? If the answer is that it can distribute among all denominations that are Christian equally, then that would be establishment of Christianity above other religions. Pat Robertson agreed with Rehnquist and added his own testimony or touch regarding the states. This is what Pat Robertson wrote. The First Amendment says, Congress can't set up a national religion. End of story. There is not in the Constitution at any point anything that applies that to the states. Now, what is Pat Robertson saying here? You see, in those times, there was a strong movement in favor of states' rights. Those who advocated for states' rights argued that the establishment and free exercise clauses of the Constitution apply on a federal level, because the First Amendment says Congress shall not make any law. In other words, this law does not apply to the individual states. It might sound nice to keep the federal government out of the business of the states, but there was a hidden agenda in this states' rights movement. If enough states could agree on a certain agenda, then they could exert influence to force the federal government to follow their lead by amending the Constitution. Now let's talk about the strategy of the religious right during this period of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. At the beginning of the religious right movement, they held massive marches to Washington, D.C. For example, the Washington for Jesus rally took place on April 29 and 30, 1980. Pat Robertson marched to Washington, D.C. with a large cross on his shoulder and hundreds of church members, not his own church, but Christians, marching along with him. However, in the course of time, the movement became much more sophisticated than marches on Washington. They soon discovered that marches accomplished very little. They discovered that the best way to gain power was by lobbying individual members of Congress as well as networking on a local level. They realized that they would meet with much greater success if they organized on a local level by taking over local high school boards and influencing local governments. They came to realize that all politics is local. They realized that if they could take over local precincts, then the states would be theirs as well, and if the states were theirs, then the government, the federal government, would be theirs as well. You know, it's notable that in 1888, those who pressed for a national Sunday law also worked on establishing local chapters and influencing state conventions before attempting a national Sunday law. Ralph Reed, one of the leaders of the religious right movement during the period that we're discussing, said the following words: "We tried to charge Washington." These are the mass demonstrations where they had Christians march to Washington, D.C. "We tried to charge Washington when we should have been focusing on the states. The real battle of concern to Christians are in the neighborhoods, school boards, city councils, and state legislatures." So they started working on a local level because they realized that they could cause a greater impact by working there. Now, during this period, Christians felt that they were being persecuted, particularly those who sympathized with the views of the religious right. In the 80s, there was talk of amending the Constitution to protect Christians from discrimination in the exercise of their religion. The leaders of the religious right movement argued that a secular humanistic government was persecuting them because it did not allow them, for example, to put nativity scenes on federal property or government property, and because the Alabama judiciary did not allow Judge Roy Moore, for example, to put a 5,300-pound monument of the Ten Commandments in the rotunda of the state Capitol building. The leaders attempted to convince their church members that government was persecuting them because it did not support their religious views. However, this was not the case. The government must keep aloof from religion. It must neither support nor oppose religion. The role of government is to preserve the freedoms that we have, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly among them, so that religion can flourish freely. The purpose of the government is not to enforce the Ten Commandments, particularly the first four. The first four commandments describe our duty towards God. The state can have nothing to do with these commandments. The Contract with the American Family, page 1, complained about the rights of religious Americans and suggested a religious amendment as the solution to the problem. So in other words, the Contract with the American Family said we can amend the Constitution, and that way Christians will not be discriminated against because, for example, they can't put nativity scenes on federal government property. This is what the Contract with the American Family, page 1, stated. "We have witnessed the steady erosion of the time-honored rights of religious Americans. The time has now come to amend the Constitution to restore freedom of speech for America's people of faith." Their view of freedom of speech was putting nativity scenes on public property, putting the Ten Commandments on government property, etc. In no way was religious freedom curtailed. People could go to church, people could go from home to home proselytizing, people could speak in the public square as individuals in favor of their religious belief. There was really no persecution. But because the church could not do things with the state, they were suffering persecution according to this group. Now, there is no country in the world that guarantees the freedom of speech in its Constitution, such as the United States of America. The freedoms we enjoy have made it a pleasure to live in the United States of America. Sadly, some that belonged to the religious right at the end of the 20th century were saying that if secular humanists do not like it here in the United States, they should move to another country. Several years ago, Greg J. Dixon, who was the co-founder of the Moral Majority and the organization's leader in the state of Indiana, actually had a prayer hit list where his supporters prayed that the Lord would remove from office anyone who did not confess the Christian religion. Alaska Senator Edna DeVry once stated that non-Christians should, and I quote, leave the country. The religious right complained that kids could no longer pray in public schools, that prayer was kicked out of public school, and the Bible was kicked out of public school, that liberals had kicked God out of the public square. It is true that school-mandated prayer would be unconstitutional. However, and of course the reason why is because prayer is a duty that we belong to God. The government does not need to get involved in prayer. However, the Constitution does not forbid individual students from praying in public school. In fact, students constitutionally can actually take the initiative to organize prayer groups in school, as long as it's their initiative and not mandated by the school itself. They can organize for prayer. They can organize for Bible study groups. The Constitution guarantees the right of free exercise of individuals, even on government property. The Constitution also guarantees that students can take their Bibles to the school and they can freely read them in the school. So there is no persecution against those who pray individually or pray with groups of students, as long as it's not mandated by the federal government. It is true that a handful of teachers at that time attempted to keep students from exercising their individual rights, but they lost their cases in court. The government must remain neutral in matters of religion. Another thing that occurred during this period was having voter guides. Politicians who wanted to win elections catered to the preachers and the churches. Even Democrats who used to shy away from speaking about religion in the public arena began to address publicly moral and religious issues. During the height of the Christian right movement, politicians loved to show up at religious right activities because they knew that they could deliver votes, rallying the base to go out and vote for them. That's why they went to churches. During the presidency of George W. Bush, a leak revealed that Karl Rove and Dick Cheney really had little love for the agenda of the religious right. In private, they referred to them as nuts and weird. However, they publicly supported their causes because they knew that the religious right brings out the vote. If you remember, in 1888, there was also a move for voter guides. During the height of the power of the moral majority and the Christian coalition, voter guides even provided the names of candidates and the causes they supported and opposed. The religious right sought to persuade Christians to vote for candidates that supported their causes and to vote against those who opposed them. For example, Tim LaHaye affirmed that 25% of federal jobs should go to Christian conservatives. That's interesting. He also stated, and I quote, "No humanist is qualified to hold any governmental office." That's Time Magazine, September 2, 1985. This flies in the face of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, where it clearly states that there can be no religious test to occupy any office of trust in these United States. Another interesting feature of the Christian right during this period was the desire to come together with Catholics. Protestants and Catholics, you remember that leading up to 1888, the same thing happened. During the heyday of the religious right, Protestants and Catholics worked together for common social causes. Now I'm going to share with you some very interesting information that you might not know about. On August 12, 1993, Billy Graham appeared on the program Good Morning America. At the time, Pope John Paul II was visiting the United States of America. And I heard with my own ears Billy Graham say, "I admire the Pope. We both address the same moral issues." Furthermore, on January 21, 1997, when the Pope visited Salt Lake City, Larry King interviewed Billy Graham on his program, Larry King Live. Here is a portion of the interview that I'm going to share with you. Larry King asked, "Do you feel comfortable with Salt Lake City? Do you feel comfortable with the Vatican?" Here's Graham's answer. "Oh, I'm very comfortable with the Vatican. I've been to see the Pope several times. And in fact, the day that he was inaugurated, made Pope, I was preaching in his cathedral in Krakow. I was his guest." King said to Billy Graham, "You were preaching in his church the day he was made Pope?" Graham answered, "That is correct, in Krakow." And Graham chuckled when he said that. Larry King then said, "You must have been shocked." Billy Graham answered, "Of course I was. There was shouting in the streets, you know." The next day, "Polish Pope, Polish Pope." And then King asked Billy Graham, "Do you like this Pope?" Billy Graham answered, "I like him very much. He's very conservative. He and I agree on almost everything." Very interesting. The dean of all evangelists, the most well-known Protestant evangelist, I think, ever in the United States of America. Most people do not know that Billy Graham received an honorary doctorate degree in 1967 from a Roman Catholic Jesuit university called Belmont Abbey College. Someone wrote the college and asked if it was true that Billy Graham had received a doctorate from this Jesuit university. And Cuthbert E. Allen, executive vice president of the university, responded in these words: "Billy Graham gave an inspiring and theologically sound address that might have been given by Bishop Fulton J. Sheen or any other Catholic preacher. I have followed Billy Graham's career, and I must emphasize that he has been more Catholic than otherwise. I say this not in a partisan manner, but as a matter of fact. I would state that he could bring Catholics and Protestants together in a healthy ecumenical spirit." Let me read that again. This is Cuthbert Allen, who was a Jesuit, and he was actually the president of this Jesuit university. Here it is. "I would state that he could bring Catholics and Protestants together in a healthy ecumenical spirit. I was the first Catholic to invite Billy Graham. I know that he will speak at 3 other Catholic universities next month. I believe he will be invited by more Catholic colleges in the future than Protestant colleges. So I am well pleased then to answer your question. Billy Graham is preaching a moral and evangelical theology most acceptable to Catholics." Very interesting, isn't it? Ralph Reed, who was the first president of Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition, wrote in his book, politically incorrect, page 16, the following words: "The future of American politics lies in the growing strength of evangelicals and their Roman Catholic allies." So notice he's seen the future of American politics, and he says that the secret of success lies in the growing strength of evangelicals and their Roman Catholic allies. Then he continues, if these two core constituencies, evangelicals comprising the swing vote in the South, Catholics holding sway in the North, if they can cooperate on issues and support like-minded candidates, they can determine the outcome of almost any election in the nation. Are you seeing what's happening here? In other words, it's Catholics and Protestants trying to influence the election in the United States of America. He continues, nasty nativism and dark distrust about popery and foreign influence have been swept into the ash heap of history. John F. Kennedy's election, which we will refer to in our next presentation, John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 buried the Catholic boogeyman forever. No longer burdened by the past. He who forgets the past, folks, is bound to repeat the past, especially the negative mistakes of the past. So here, no longer burdened by the past, Roman Catholics, evangelicals, Greek Orthodox, and many religious conservatives from the mainline denominations are forging a new alliance that promises to be among the most powerful and important in the modern political era. So you see, the idea is joining all religions together to fight a common enemy by using the power of the state. Ralph Reed also gave a speech to the Catholic Campaign for America, and he spoke the following words: "The Catholic vote holds the key to the future, and I believe that if they can unite, if Catholics can unite with the evangelical Christians, the Protestants who share their views on the sanctity of innocent human life and the need for religious liberty and school choice and common sense values, I believe if Catholics and evangelicals can unite, there is no person who runs for office in any city or any state in America that can't be elected, and there is no bill that can't be passed in either House of Congress or any state legislative chamber anywhere in America." What is the agenda again? Is the agenda, well, let's preach the gospel from our pulpits so that the Holy Spirit will change the lives of people, and then you have a more just and moral society. No, that's not the secret according to him. The secret is for Protestants and Catholics to come together and use the political system to implement the agenda of the church. He continued writing, "It is the emerging force in the electorate today," that is the union of Catholics and Protestants. The Pope does use the term hierarchy of doctrine. Father Robertson said, "Obviously some teachings are more important than others, and there has to be an agreement on those essential points, while leaving considerable latitude on other points that are less essential to the faith." Now I'm going to read a statement that I read before from the writings of Ellen White. But before I do, I'm going to read the last part of the statement that I just presented. Father Robertson said, "Obviously some teachings are more important than others, and there has to be an agreement on those essential points while leaving considerable latitude on other points that are less essential to the faith." Is there such a thing as essential points in your faith and non-essential or less essential points? Compare this that Ralph Reed said with what Ellen White wrote. Great Controversy, page 445. "When the leading churches of the United States uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image to the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. So the idea is unite on points of doctrine that are held in common, and then get the state to do what the church wants. And Ellen White states that then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the result will be persecution. Once again, I will repeat what I said in a previous lecture, and that is that the word papacy is not the same as the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is a church. The papacy is the union of the church with the state, because you know the Catholic Church, the papacy is actually a church, and it is also a state. So what happened in 1798? In 1798, the Pope Pius VI was taken prisoner to France, where he died in exile. In other words, the political arm of the Roman Catholic Church was removed. Now, let me ask you this. Did the Roman Catholic churches as churches still continue to function? Of course. People still took their little babies to get baptized. People still went to the confessional. People still went to participate of the Eucharist. In other words, the Catholic Church as church did not cease to function when the papacy received the deadly wound when the Pope was taken prisoner to France and died in exile. The church continued to function, but the papacy did not, because the papacy had lost the support of France and then later on the other nations of Europe. So the point is that when the United States imposes a Sunday law on pain of civil penalties, the bottom line is that that's going to be an image of the Roman Catholic papacy, because that is the foundational characteristic of the papacy. So once again, Ellen White wrote, when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image to the Roman hierarchy. There is the image of the beast. And the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. So when the church joins with the state, when the church, no longer are denominations fighting among one another, then they're able to influence the state. The result, the automatic result, is persecution. History has clearly shown that. Then we have the document, Evangelicals and Catholics Together. We're talking now about how Protestants and Catholics are coming together during this period of the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. What was this document, Evangelicals and Catholics Together? The document was an ecumenical agreement by 40 of the most influential evangelical and Roman Catholic representatives in the United States of America. Protestant Chuck Colson and Lutheran turned Catholic John Richard Newhouse developed the 25-page document. When the 40 influential leaders signed the document on March 29, 1994, Chuck Colson and Richard Newhouse remarked the following: evangelicals and Catholics have been finding one another as Christian brothers and sisters in various activities, notably in the pro-life movement and the charismatic renewal. Our concern was and is that animosities between evangelicals and Catholics threatened to mar the image of Christ by turning Latin America into a Belfast of religious warfare. What is it that Newhouse and Colson are saying here? Well, one of the notable elements of the document is that it recommends and actually discourages proselytizing between Catholics and Protestants, especially in Latin America, where there were at the time, and still are, thousands upon thousands abandoning the Roman Catholic Church and joining Protestant churches, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, Mormons, and Baptists. This mass exodus from the Roman Catholic Church to various Protestant denominations has been a matter of great concern for the Roman Catholic Church. And so in the document that was signed by Catholics and Protestants, the great leaders, they agreed officially to stop stealing one another's sheep. They agreed that instead of arguing over insignificant points of doctrine, they should rather unite forces to fight against the common enemy, secular humanism. They decided to join forces to fight in causes such as against abortion, homosexual marriage or gay marriage, euthanasia, pornography, etc. An article appeared in USA Today commenting about the ecumenical nature of this particular document. This was March 30, 1994. The leaders, in a statement, are urging the nation's 52 million Catholics and 13 million evangelicals to no longer hold each other at theological arm's length and stop aggressive proselytizing of each other's flocks. In short, to turn their theological swords into a recognition of a common faith. Interesting. Keith Fournier, who was one of the signers of the document, wrote a book titled House United, where he described the incredible ecumenical implications of this particular document. Now I quote, "Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox can come together, must come together, and are coming together. The wall of separation is cracking, that is, between Catholics and Protestants. Portions of the wall are beginning to fall away. Christians are waking up and starting to see each other as family." Now, the question is, how could Protestants reach this point where they're willing to stretch forth the hand and take the hand of Roman Catholics, setting aside the differences in doctrine and fighting for common social causes? Obviously, there has been a radical change of attitude of Protestants towards the Roman Catholic Church. The question is, why? Well, I want to share with you a historical experience that took place in the times when John F. Kennedy was running for President of the United States of America. This was in the year 1960. And it was during a very heated campaign. And the Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas, were very concerned that perhaps John F. Kennedy, if he became president, he would implement Roman Catholic principles into the United States. In other words, religious freedom would come to an end. Persecution would arise. So in 1960, Protestants were still very suspicious of the aspirations of the Roman Catholic papacy. I want to read to you what John F. Kennedy said to those religious leaders, those pastors of the Ministerial Association of the Houston area. You know, John F. Kennedy almost sounded like a Protestant here. I read, this is September 12, 1960. "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute." So what did John Kennedy, the Roman Catholic, believe? First Roman Catholic president in the history of the United States. He said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an American that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace, or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. Wow! But the fact is that John F. Kennedy had to go to this meeting and he had to explain that he was not going to follow the instructions of the Pope, that he was going to follow the Constitution of the United States, because these ministers in Houston feared to have a Roman Catholic president because they knew the history of the Roman Catholic papacy. They wanted to make sure that John F. Kennedy would abide by the Constitution and not simply inject into the United States the principles of the Roman Catholic Church. How interesting. Now, in our next segment, we're going to take a look at some additional evidence on the desire of Protestants to join with Roman Catholics in these common causes and setting aside their differences in doctrine. But now let me share with you another couple of points as to why Protestants and Catholics feel more and more comfortable with one another, even though their doctrinal systems are just radically different. If they went by what the Bible says and what their doctrines are, they could never unite, because the doctrines and the practices are so different between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. What is it that led to the melting of the ice between Protestants and Roman Catholics? Two issues that I want to address as we move along. First of all, Vatican Council II. Vatican Council II, under the leadership of John XXIII and then Pope Paul VI, because John XXIII died before the council was over, took place between the years 1962 and 1965. The purpose of the council was to renew the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, the Italian word that was used was aggiornamento. In other words, a renewal of the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church actually invited Protestant observers to come. And if you read the conciliar documents, you're going to find that they're very conciliatory towards Protestants. And so, as a result, in the course of time, Protestants started thinking, well, you know, the Roman Catholic Church actually recognizes us as ecclesiastical societies, so, you know, maybe the Catholic Church isn't what it used to be. Maybe the papacy isn't what it used to be. The fact is, folks, that the papacy cannot change. You say, why not? Because if the papacy decides that it's not going to be a state, it's only going to be a church, it's not the papacy anymore. Because as I mentioned, the papacy is a system where you have a church and a state in one. You know, take, for example, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Seventh-day Adventist Church has a president, but we are not a political entity. We are a church. We are not a state. But when it comes to the Roman Catholic Church is a church, and it is also a state. And as a state, it has nuncios, other countries call them ambassadors, that represent the Vatican before practically every country in the world. And so this church, through its nuncios, can influence the political systems of the many nations, because the papacy is not only a church, it is also a state. So it can use the power of the states of the world to implement its agenda. And so one of the ways in which the ice was melted was, first of all, because of the election of John F. Kennedy. And by the way, while he was president, of course he was assassinated, but during his presidency, he did not introduce Roman Catholic principles into the United States government. So people said, oh, we feared that Roman Catholic was going to be president of the United States. We had absolutely no reason to fear. And then you have Vatican II, where even Protestant observers are invited to come. And Protestants are no longer called heretics, they're called separated brethren. And they're called the daughters of the church, and the mother is calling them back into union with the church. In other words, the language is very conciliatory. And so Protestants say, you know, the Catholic Church, the papacy is no longer any danger to Protestantism because the papacy has changed. It can't change. It can't change for the simple reason that it would no longer be the papacy if it decided to be a church and not a state. You know, it reminds me of what Jesus said. You know, when Pilate asked Jesus whether he was a king, what did Jesus say? He said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I would not be arrested." Jesus was offered all the kingdoms of the world on the Mount of Temptation. And we find that when Satan offered him all of the kingdoms of the world, Jesus refused to look. He said, "No, I will not receive the kingdoms of the world. I did not come to take over the throne of the world." And when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was agonizing, sweating drops of blood. We find that a religious guard of the Jewish temple comes to arrest Jesus Christ. And of course, Peter, who the Roman Catholic Church believes was the first pope, he takes out his sword, and he swings his sword, and he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. You know, my own personal opinion is that he was not intending to cut off his ear. He was intending to cut off his head. But Peter was a fisherman. He was not a soldier, so he missed. You know, that's just speculation. I don't think he had such good aim that he just wanted to cut off his ear. He wanted to kill him because they came to arrest his master. What did Jesus say to Peter? "Well done, Peter. Thanks for using the sword to try and defend me." That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, "Peter, put away that sword, for whoever kills with the sword will die by the sword." And it's no coincidence that in Revelation chapter 13, when it speaks about the healing of the deadly wound, we are told that the papacy was wounded by the sword. That is, by the sword of the civil power. And the way in which the papacy will recover its power, when the pause will end between the first period of tribulation and the second period of tribulation of the single tribulation, is when the civil power of the United States and then of the entire world lends their power to the Roman Catholic papacy to implement Sunday as the day of rest. It's going to happen, folks. And you might think, no, it's not going to happen. It would never happen in the United States of America. You know, mandating Sunday by law and forbidding Sabbath observance, that's never going to happen. But it happened during the 1880s. You know, the law was not finally implemented. It was stopped, but the movement was there. The movement, as we're noticing, was also there in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. And we're seeing a lot of things happening today, which we'll see in a future lecture, that show that it could very well happen in our time as well. A third factor that makes Protestants feel perfectly at ease with the Roman Catholic papacy is their view of end-time prophecy. You see, Protestants today, conservative Protestants, evangelicals, believe that the Antichrist is going to arise and sit in the temple in the Middle East. And the church, of course, by this time will be gone in the rapture. And then that Antichrist, sitting in a rebuilt Jewish temple, is going to create a great big statue and is going to command everyone to worship that great big image or that great big statue. And he's going to place a tattoo on the foreheads and the right hand of those individuals who are left behind after the rapture. And so all Christian eyes these days are looking to the Middle East for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. They're looking to the Muslims, and they're looking to all of the events that are happening over in Israel, and they're saying, look, prophecy is being fulfilled over there. And meanwhile, the prophecies that have to do with the papacy, which is the beast, the little horn, the abomination of desolation, the harlot, whatever name the Bible uses to describe this system, they cannot see the role of the papacy in the fulfillment of prophecy because they're looking in the wrong place. So the enemy is the Muslims. The enemy is not the Roman Catholic Church, so they feel comfortable with the papacy. And so The same with the United States in prophecy. Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 to 18, clearly points out that the United States is going to make an image of the papacy by uniting church and state. But Protestantism says, oh no, the image is going to be this great big statue that's going to be built over in the Middle East. And they don't see that they're living in the country that is going to fulfill Bible prophecy, where a Sunday law is going to be enacted, and whoever does not go along will be persecuted. Even a decree not to be able to buy or sell, a decree eventually that enforces the death penalty upon those who keep God's holy Sabbath. So these are the reasons why Protestantism these days is feeling comfortable with the papacy. Another factor, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on in our talks, is that Protestantism has become politically correct. Ellen White calls it false charity. It's being nice. Let's just be nice. Even when we see something that's done that is wrong, don't rebuke it, don't say that it's wrong, everybody's okay. Postmodern thinking has basically blurred the distinction between right and wrong, between good and evil. And for that reason, people feel comfortable with that which the Bible openly opposes. So we still have to study part 2 of this presentation. Right now we are talking about, what is happening in the 80s, in the 90s, and the early 2000s. And the point that we're dealing with is how Protestants and Catholics are coming together. Now in our next presentation, we are going to finish this particular point, and we're going to talk about other parallels between what happened in the 1880s and what is happening in the world today. And we will see that what is taking place is actually a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. So folks, the Bible is very clear on what the end-time conflict is going to be about. In Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17, we are told what the conflict is going to be. It's going to be over the commandments of God, particularly the fourth commandment. It says in Revelation 12 verse 17, "Then the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed." That is the final remnant. What are their characteristics? They keep the commandments of God. That's all of them, folks, just like they're written in Exodus chapter 20. They keep the commandments of God, and they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. My desire of heart is that all those who are listening will choose to be on the Lord's side in this great final conflict.